Good evening and welcome. My name is Stephen Kantrowitz, and I'm the Senior Director of Cultural Arts at the J. On behalf of the J's SAGE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment Program, and our co-sponsor, the Detroit Jewish Book Fair, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's fascinating program, Antisemitism, History's Unlearned Lesson with author Maurice Samuels. SAGE is endowed by a generous gift from Sis Maisel and supported by Carol and Ronald F. Fogel, Sherry and David Jaffa, and Elena Michael Serling through the J's Pillar of Light program. We thank all of our donors for their continued support. SAGE has a wide range of incredible events over the next several months, including The Judge Who Condemned the Rosenbergs with author Martin J. Siegel on Wednesday, February 21st at 7 p.m. Please visit jccdet.org/sage for more info. We're also co-sponsoring Hedy, the life and inventions of Hedy Lamarr on Thursday, March 14th at 7:30 p.m. Tickets are available through theberman.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Maurice Samuels is the Betty Jane Anlyan Professor of French at Yale University, where he also directs the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, he is the author of 5 books, including Alfred Dreyfus, The Man at the Center of the Affair, which will be published by Yale University Press in its Jewish Lives series on February 27th and is available with a 25% discount code Dreyfus at www.jewishlives.org. Professor Samuels will be joined in conversation by Howard Lupovitch, Professor of History and the Director of the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. He specializes in modern Jewish history, specifically the Jews of Hungary and the Habsburg monarchy. Please welcome Maurice Samuels.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you to Lauren also, and thanks to Howard for agreeing to lead the conversation. And thank you to everyone here for coming. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Dreyfus Affair and of my take on it, and then I'm looking forward to talking with Howard and hearing your questions. So in late 1894, the French army discovered there was a traitor in its midst. The intelligence service had uncovered a letter written by a French officer proposing to sell military secrets to Germany. Based on the kind of secrets described in the letter, the intelligence service reasoned that it had to have been written by an intern officer on the Army's general staff. And when they examined the list of general staff interns, they immediately focused on the sole Jewish name, Alfred Dreyfus. His handwriting bore a superficial similarity to the letter. It was enough. Dreyfus was arrested, court-martialed, found guilty by the military judges based on very little evidence, and deported to the brutal prison colony of Devil's Island off the coast of South America to serve a life sentence. Meanwhile, back in Paris, his wife Lucie and his brother Mathieu began a long campaign to prove his innocence. At first, they had nothing to go on and very few allies. Even most of their fellow French Jews could not believe that the army had made a mistake of that magnitude. Slowly, however, the truth began to come to light. The first big break was the discovery that the actual traitor was a dissolute nobleman named Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. Unlike Dreyfus, who was an ardent patriot from a wealthy family and had no motive for the crime, Esterhazy was deeply in debt and barely able to hide his distaste for France. He basically had traitor written across his forehead. The Dreyfus family soon learned not only that the army knew that Esterhazy was the actual traitor, but that it had actively tried to cover up his crime in order to avoid admitting that Dreyfus was innocent. Once the family made this information public, the movement to free Dreyfus began to gain steam. Soon, all of France was divided between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. The Dreyfusards, those who supported Dreyfus, believed that justice for the individual was paramount, even if it meant calling the army's integrity into question. The anti-Dreyfusards held that reason of state trumped the rights of the individual and that the army's word could not be doubted under any circumstances. Some of the anti-Dreyfusards were no doubt motivated solely by patriotism, but many of them were anti-Semites who did not believe that a Jew like Dreyfus could ever really be French. What came to be known as the Dreyfus Affair pitted two visions of the nation against each other. One was democratic, liberal, and pluralistic, open to Jews and other minorities, and the other was authoritarian, reactionary, and racist. By 1898, when Esterhazy was brought to trial for treason, France was on the brink of a civil war. Despite the obvious evidence of his guilt, the military tribunal found Esterhazy innocent. It was then that the novelist Émile Zola decided to intervene, penning an article entitled J'accuse, I accuse, in which he exposed the army's framing of Dreyfus and cover-up of Esterhazy's crime. In response, anti-Semitic riots erupted all over France and colonial Algeria. Zola was then brought to trial himself for slander and found guilty. But Dreyfus's supporters did not give up. Eventually, an honest member of the Army's intelligence service discovered that many of the main pieces of evidence against Dreyfus had been shown to the military judges at the trials were forgeries. The forger, a high-ranking member of the intelligence service, slit his own throat in prison. Now it seemed finally like truth was on the march, to borrow a famous phrase from Zola. Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island to face a second court-martial in the summer of 1899. Frail, white-haired, and shattered by his suffering, the 39-year-old Dreyfus knew nothing of the movement that had taken shape on his behalf. The entire world was watching as he testified a second time at his court-martial in Rennes. And the shock was profound when he was found guilty a second time, albeit with extenuating circumstances. How there could be extenuating circumstances when it came to treason, the judges did not say, but it was clear that the military would never admit its mistake. The government then decided to take matters into its own hands. Worried that the world would boycott the Paris World's Fair of 1900 to protest France's miscarriage of justice, the Prime Minister offered Dreyfus a pardon. Although his most ardent supporters urged him to refuse, Dreyfus could not survive, clearly, a return to prison. He agreed to the pardon on the condition that he be allowed to continue the fight to clear his name. The tensions surrounding the affair dissipated over the next few years. Dreyfus was awarded the Legion of Honor, but when the army refused to give him the promotion in rank that he deserved, he resigned. During World War I, he once again took up arms for France, as did his son Pierre, who fought heroically in many major battles. Dreyfus died in 1935, just as Hitler was consolidating his power in Germany. The Dreyfus family was not spared the horror of the Holocaust. Lucie, his wife, now a widow, went into hiding under an assumed name during the war, and Dreyfus's favorite granddaughter, Madeleine, a resistance fighter, was murdered in Auschwitz. The Dreyfus Affair has been the subject of more scholarship than any other event in French history, except for the French Revolution. So when the Jewish Lives series at Yale University Press approached me about writing a biography of Dreyfus, at first I didn't see what I could contribute that was really new. But as I began to dig into the literature surrounding the affair, I realized that Dreyfus himself tends to get sidelined. He's often considered not a very interesting or even a likable figure, and some historians say he didn't even understand what was at stake in his own case. I also realized that the Jewish dimension of the case has rarely been the focus of scholarship. This lacuna dates back to the time of the affair itself, when Jewish supporters of Dreyfus, anxious to avoid seeming as if they had supported the Jewish officer merely out of sectarian impulses, attempted to universalize the case, casting it as a fight for liberal principles, truth, justice, democracy, etc., rather than as a case about anti-Semitism. So I set out to write a biography of Dreyfus that would put the man himself front and center. And this proved to be harder than it seemed, since Dreyfus was an intensely private person, timid, shy even. As I say at the start of the book, he would have hated to be the subject of a biography. He tried always to project the image of a proper military officer, dignified, impassive, a bit rigid. And this didn't help him in his court appearances, where he came off as cold and aloof. But as I read the remarkable letters that he exchanged with his wife Lucie while he was on Devil's Island, and his diary that he kept, a different picture of the man began to emerge. Léon Blum, France's first practicing Jewish prime minister, famously wrote in 1936, right after Dreyfus's death, that if Dreyfus hadn't been Dreyfus, he may not even have been a Dreyfusard. This, I came to believe, was totally untrue. Dreyfus understood exactly what was at stake in his case, and it was only thanks to the heroic manner in which he withstood what can only be described as torture on Devil's Island that the cause of justice, all those universal values, justice, democracy, etc., would eventually triumph in his case. He was truly the hero of his own affair. His letters and diary also reveal him to have been passionately devoted not just to France and to the cause of justice, but also to his family, and especially to his wife, Lucie. In the book, I try to give some sense of what it felt like for someone like Dreyfus, intensely committed to the honor of France, to be accused of the worst crime imaginable, treason, and of what resources he drew on to pursue the fight to clear his name. I also placed the Jewish dimension of the case front and center. And this meant three main things. First, it meant exploring the role of Jewishness in Dreyfus's life and that of his family. Second, it meant placing the question of anti-Semitism front and center in my discussion of the affair. And third, it meant exploring the significance that Dreyfus's life had for the lives of Jews around the world. And I'll touch briefly on what these three things entail, and then we'll start the discussion. So first, the role of Jewishness in Dreyfus's life. Dreyfus grew up in an upper middle class and very Jewish milieu in Alsace, in eastern France. All his siblings married Jews, as did both his children and every other member of the Dreyfus family, at least until World War II. He himself was married in the Grand Synagogue in Paris by France's chief rabbi, who was a friend of his wife Lucie's family. While it's true that Dreyfus himself was not a particularly religious person in the spiritual sense, he was too much of a rationalist, he attended synagogue on major holidays and on the yahrzeits of family members. But Jewishness was largely a private matter for Dreyfus and his family, which was typical for French Jews of his class. Most scholars refer to Dreyfus as an assimilated Jew because he chose a career in the military and made few mentions of what we would call his Jewish identity in public. But if assimilation connotes the surrendering of Jewish identity to become French, as I explain in the book, this represents a misunderstanding of the specific form of Jewish identity that took shape over the course of the 19th century in France, so-called Franco-Judaism, which did not view the process of becoming French as a zero-sum game for Jews. Indeed, for the generations of Jews who integrated into French culture in the 19th century, Frenchness and Jewishness went hand in hand. And this was because the France that Dreyfus and others like him loved and yearned to be part of was the France of the French Revolution, the France that had declared its fidelity to universalist values by becoming the first European country to grant the Jews full civil rights. As Jews, they therefore felt doubly French, since it was their emancipation that had helped define the new kind of nation that France had become. Now, this model of the nation was called into question by the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism that began in France in the 1880s. And in the book, I emphasize how central anti-Semitism was to every aspect of the Dreyfus Affair. If the affair raised key issues for liberal democracy at a critical moment in world history, it did so because Dreyfus was Jewish. It was not a coincidence that when the French military learned it had a traitor in its ranks, suspicion fell on the one Jew on the general staff. Although anti-Semitism was not the sole factor leading to Dreyfus's arrest and conviction, it was the critical one. And it was also critical to why his case divided the French nation. There had been other cases of military espionage and of wrongful conviction before Dreyfus, and there have been many since. None turned into an affair. French people cared so deeply about this case, primarily, if not exclusively, because Dreyfus was a Jew. It was Dreyfus's Jewishness that made the case about more than spying and more than the failures of military justice. As increasing numbers of Jewish immigrants flocked to Western democracies in the late 19th century, fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, the so-called Jewish question, which asked whether Jews belonged in the modern nation state as full and equal citizens, came to the fore. It was an especially fraught topic of debate in France. France, as I said, had been the first European country to grant Jews full civil rights during the French Revolution, but it was also the country where the reaction against Jewish emancipation was felt most intensely in the late 19th century. And I think if you asked observers in 1899, at the height of the Dreyfus Affair, to predict which country was most likely to unleash a genocide against Jews, they would very likely have guessed France. And yet the Holocaust did not start in France, even if the Vichy government contributed to its implementation. This was largely because the affair diffused the time bomb of French anti-Semitic prejudice, or at least delayed its explosion, by mobilizing much of the French left against anti-Semitism. The creation of organizations like the Human Rights League during the affair helped form a bulwark against hatred, as did the courageous stance taken by certain socialist leaders in defense of the Jewish officer. The final part of my Jewish life of Dreyfus explores the effect of Dreyfus's life on the lives of Jews around the world at the time. In his humorous story, Dreyfus in Kazrelevka, the Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem satirizes the way small-town Jews in the Russian Empire obsessed over the case, coming to view Dreyfus as one of their own and taking his plight to heart. Paris, they say, seethed like a boiling vat, but the anguish and pain that Kazrelevka underwent, Paris will not experience till Judgment Day, Sholem Aleichem jokingly tells us. The effect on Jews was the same in Berlin or New York as in the fictional Ukrainian shtetl. And in the book, I explore how Jewish newspapers in French, English, German, Hebrew, and Yiddish covered the case and understood its implications. The affair offered a kind of mirror in which Jews of all political persuasions saw their fears and beliefs reflected at a moment of great transformation and upheaval for Jewish communities around the world. As such, I argue, it serves as a valuable lens for exploring the development of Jewish political thought on the eve of the 20th century. In 2009, a book appeared with the title, Why the Dreyfus Affair Matters. The author, Louis Begley, drew a connection between the suffering of the prisoner on Devil's Island and the outrage of Guantanamo, where the United States military continues to hold prisoners for ill-defined reasons of state. Since then, the parallels between the affair and our own moment have only grown more apparent. The life of Dreyfus forces us to consider what it means when the institutions of liberal democracy come under assault and when half a nation commits to believing a lie. The life of Dreyfus also allows us to understand what it takes for truth to triumph against such lies and how a nation can emerge from political crisis with faith in its institutions intact. As anti-Semitism now stages a comeback in France, the United States, and around the world today, the affair has much to tell us, not only about the causes of hatred, but also, I think, about the ways that hatred can be resisted. For these and other reasons, the Dreyfus Affair continues to matter now more than ever. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Well, Maurice, thank you, first of all, for writing this book. I don't know if anyone out there has had the experience of reading any other books in the Jewish Lives series. I was mentioning to Maurice earlier that what I like about the Jewish Lives series, and this is just the latest in a long series of Jewish biographies, is they do two things really well. First of all, they find the right person to write the biography, and clearly you're the right person to write this book.
Thank you.
But also, you know, as the name of the series connotes, Jewish Lives, they foreground the individual. And I think it's something very important, as you alluded to, is that, you know, when we hear about Dreyfus, we often think of the larger context, the larger picture, and much less about Dreyfus himself. I have to admit, I'm guilty of that myself. I taught about Dreyfus last week in my class, as I was telling you, and I spoke much more about that broader context around it, about the broader phenomenon of anti-Semitism. And I really enjoyed the way you put Dreyfus, the man, at the center of this book, because as a case study, he's so interesting. So why don't I throw a couple of questions at you we can talk about,
Sure.
Having to do with Dreyfus and this larger story, and then I'll watch for questions as they come up in the comments. Because when I was reading your book, especially as you came all the way forward to the present at the end, I was reminded something I remember from the 1980s. So I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial of France, which was celebrated in 1989. And as bicentennials go, it really put the American bicentennial to shame. I mean, ours bicentennial was great. The French bicentennial was just off the hook. But I remember at the time reading that while most people in France were celebrating, there were other people in France who were mourning, who saw that anniversary, who saw the French Revolution not as a great moment forward, but as a great disaster. The descendants of aristocrats, anyone who came from a family connected to the church. I mean, I mention this because one of the things you bring out the book is this: Dreyfus lived amidst a kind of French political schizophrenia, where there's a current pushing one way and there's a counter current pushing the other way, and that was there before the Dreyfus Affair. So maybe a little bit situate Dreyfus and then and the beginnings of this story in that larger tension between these two currents, because you spoke to pro-republic, anti-republic, but let's get a sense of just how deeply this ran.
Yeah, and I think thanks for that question. And I think you're absolutely right that it's there's this fundamental rift in French political life. French historians call it often, in French, they would say la guerre franco-française, so the Franco-French War. It's a kind of ideological civil war that as you alluded to, goes back to the French Revolution and this idea of what kind of nation France would become. Would it be a liberal, universalist, pluralist democracy along the lines of the United States? Or would it be a more deterministic ethno-state, basically, with that gave privileges to certain people and kept other ones either down or out altogether? That was basically what the French Revolution was about. The liberal universalists won. They killed the king, and obviously, and exiled the Catholic Church. Unbelievable that they did this in 1789. But there was a pendulum that then swung back shortly after that, and after the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the nobles come back to France. They regain their power and they try to set back the clock. The Catholic Church also recovers a lot of the power that it had before the revolution. And you see this pendulum go back and forth throughout the 19th century. There are all these revolutions that punctuate the 19th century. So you get another big one in 1830, although there are little ones. For anyone who's a fan of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, which is a novel that I teach all the time, that is about a failed revolution in 1832. There are a lot that we don't even hear about. There was another big one in 1848. There's the Commune in 1871. So you have this kind of lurching forward towards democracy or a republic, liberal universalism, and then you have a reaction all the time. And the Jews wind up, I would say, being very often the battleground on which that Franco-French War is fought. I actually wrote a whole book about that called The Right to Difference, French Universalism and the Jews. And there I argued that this whole fight over universalism often took shape as an argument about Jews in France, going back to the French Revolution and stretching forward until our own time. So in the 20th century, you get, of course, the Holocaust in France, which many people referred to as the revenge for Dreyfus, that the right wing got its revenge on the left, which had triumphed during the affair during World War II and the Holocaust. And then even after World War II, these issues still continue to divide France. And in fact, even in the last presidential election, one of the right-wing candidates, this guy Eric Zemmour, who happens to be Jewish, of Algerian Jewish background, but as a kind of dog whistle to the far right, said, well, Dreyfus's innocence has never been proved, or something like that. Like he made some, so in fact, the Dreyfus Affair still is a kind of hot button issue in this Franco-French war.
It's a great question. So here's a question right along those lines from one of our listeners, from one of our viewers. You mentioned he was from Alsace. And it's a French province, but it's a very particular one. And the fact that he was from Alsace, or we could easily, if he had been from Lorraine, it's not just incidental. That itself is also an important part of the story. Will you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So there are two eastern provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, that had originally been part of German states, but France conquered them or they became part of France in 1648. And at that moment, Jews were technically not allowed to reside in France. They had been banished in the 14th century. There were small little pockets of Jews, of Sephardic Jews, who had fled the Spanish Inquisition and settled in around Bordeaux in southwestern France. And then there were small communities of Jews in the Papal States in the south. But when France got Alsace and Lorraine, they got a community of about 20,000 Jews, which was fairly big. And at that time, they debated, like, should we just expel these Jews? But Louis XIV, the Sun King, decided that they could stay. So starting at that point in the 17th century, France therefore got this, this community of Jews who were, at that time, there were lots of restrictions on them. So they were forbidden to live in large towns or cities. They were forbidden from engaging in most guilds or professions. They were basically confined to certain trades and money lending. So they were not beloved by the local population. And I should say, and I think this is maybe what you were getting at with your question, that those territories are constantly in dispute between France and Germany. And so in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, France has this humiliating defeat, and as part of the settlement of that war, has to give up Alsace and Lorraine to the newly unified Germany. And the humiliation of that defeat and the desire for vengeance against Germany is going to obsess the French for the rest of the 19th century until World War I, when France reconquers those territories. And it was that kind of hatred for Germany for having, they referred to it as an amputation from France. It was like losing their left arm, losing Alsace and Lorraine. That's what made that was what was kind of feeding this cult of the army in France. And that was one of the things that was kind of brewing under the surface of the Dreyfus Affair. And of course, the fact that Dreyfus came from there, that's what made him such a patriot. So like the kind of main, as I talk about in the book, one of the big turning points of his childhood was watching German troops march into his hometown of Mulhouse. It was a humiliation. The Dreyfus family, who were patriots, had everyone had the choice whether they wanted to choose German citizenship or French, and most of the Jews chose French citizenship, and that required a lot of them to leave. And it was at that point that Dreyfus was sent to boarding school in Paris, and that desire for vengeance was really what was driving him. Also, that's why he joined the army.
It's so interesting, and I would just add that rivalry or that fighting over that territory, it goes back all the way to the time of Charlemagne.
Yeah.
Charlemagne had 3 sons, and one he left what's now France, and one he left what's now Österreich, which was basically Germany. The middle son, he got the territory in between. He was a weakling, and his brothers kept taking it and fighting, and all the way into the 20th century. I mean, just right. like you say, it was the arch rival. I think that's the fact that if they had been in a border province that was close to, let's say, Spain, or Italy. Italy was not their arch rivals. You want to, if you want to put it in Michigan terms, Germany is Ohio State. Right. That's how bitter the rival was, or
right. And also Alsace was also like a big center for industrialization at the time. So they were very valuable territories for that reason too. And Dreyfus's own family were involved in that. So Mulhouse, where he was from, was a big center of textile manufacturing. It was like like a real capital for that. So that was a big economic loss to France too.
And would you say that if you came from Alsace, I mean, the Dreyfus family, they were intensely patriotic, as were most Jews, as were many people in Alsace. Yeah. But do you think from the military's point of view, just being from Alsace made you more suspicious?
Well, it depends, because there were actually a lot of high-ranking French officers who were not Jewish and who were from Alsace and who didn't fall under suspicion, including the main one, Colonel Picard, who played a heroic role in the affair. He was an anti-Semite, but an honest person. And he was one of the first ones who discovered the proof of Esterhazy's guilt and went to his superiors with it and did the right thing, even though he was an anti-Semite. And he wound up, he was never suspected of being a traitor because he was from Alsace. So I think, but that was held against Dreyfus. So the fact that he spoke German, the fact that he had crossed the border a couple times to see his parents, that was held against him at trial. They were basically trying to dig up any kind of circumstantial evidence. But yeah, he was seen as as a potential traitor, partly because supposedly he spoke French with a slight German accent. I've read that in places. I would say maybe an Alsatian accent, which isn't exactly the same thing. But there is actually a really interesting audio recording of his voice from later in his life. And I'm a professor of French. I'm not a native speaker, but I speak French pretty well. But I didn't hear he sounded just regular, just French to me. But
it's such an interesting aspect of the story because as an anti-Semitic trope, I mean, that's textbook Richard Wagner, who said that not only do Jews who produce music produce something different, the way Jews speak a language is going to be inherent, it's going to be tainted. And this notion against Dreyfus is a part of it as well. Let me ask you one other background question, because this story, the trial part of this, it starts with the military. When we think proud military traditions, usually we think Prussia, we think Germany. Maybe say something about what the military meant in 19th century France, and for the military to lose that humiliating battle to the rival. I mean, how deeply, and beyond Dreyfus himself, what did the military symbolize?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the Napoleonic era, France had, because of its military, had basically conquered most of Europe at that point. And it was, the height of French glory was military glory. They kind of lose that over the course of the 19th century. There's a lot of anxiety that France is losing out in this kind of like arms race with Germany, mainly with Germany, but also with England. And one of the main fears is that France, and this was true, that France had a low birth rate compared to Germany. So there was a lot of anxiety about that the French the army wouldn't be able to have enough soldiers. So, but especially after 1870, which was a colossal military defeat. The French army goes down really quickly and embarrassingly. And so there was a real effort to figure out what had gone wrong in 1870 and to make sure that those mistakes weren't repeated in the next war. And everybody knew there would be a next war when they could reconquer Alsace and Lorraine. And where this kind of fits in interestingly with Dreyfus's story is that the army attempted to modernize after 1870, where, before 1870, a lot of the officers were just aristocratic guys who didn't have particular military expertise, but they were from the right kinds of families, had gone to the right schools, and it was a disaster in 1870. So they tried to modernize. They tried to recruit more officers, not from only from the famous military school of Saint-Cyr, but also from the École Polytechnique, which was really the top of the educational pyramid in France. And Dreyfus was one of those officers. So they were kind of modernizers who wanted to modernize the military. And Dreyfus really epitomized that kind of technocratic officer rather than the kind of good old boy aristocrat who looked great on a horse, but really didn't know, the latest kind of munitions, technical, he didn't have that, kind of technical knowledge like Dreyfus did. And so one theory, and I talk about in the book, the really top historian of the Dreyfus Affair in France is this guy named Duclair, who's excellent, but he somewhat de-emphasizes the Jewish angle in the case. And I have a slight argument with him, even though I think he's a great historian. But he tries to make the case that what was really motivating the army top brass to turn against Dreyfus was less that he was Jewish and more that he was a modernizer. So they were trying to purge him for that reason. I think they were kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, because all the Jewish officers were modernizers, and many of the modernizers were considered, Jewish or kind of lumped in with the Jews by the anti-Semites during the affair.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a great point, because Jews being not only in the army but in part of the officer corps was part of this modern republic, inclusive France, and Jews were the symbols of everything modern in France.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising it's here too.
Surprises people, I think, that there were so many Jewish officers, and it's important to keep in mind that Dreyfus was the only Jew at that moment on the general staff, but there were something like 300 Jewish officers in France, even though Jews were only 0.2% of the French population. So they were overrepresented in the military.
And I think that presence of Jews in the militaries of Europe is something that surprises people in a lot of different contexts, because apart from the Russian army, which no Jew wanted to serve in, because nobody wanted to serve in, everywhere else, in the Habsburg army, in Italy, in England, Jews not only served willingly and patriotically, it was a great career move. Yeah. And soldiers were well provisioned, and it was a decent life, and it was an honorable and respectable life. And I mean, I think that's something you bring out so well in the book, is that a military career for a late 19th century French Jew was not an anomaly. And even to be an officer was something very common in the army. But it also feeds into the fact that when the army suffers this humiliating defeat and they need an explanation, they have lots of them. I mean, yes, we're going to look for spies, but who better to suspect as a spy? Someone from the border province, maybe, but also a Jew right there. So
and you could say, like, okay, the Dreyfus Affair happened in France because France was anti-Semitic, but you could also say that the Dreyfus Affair happened in France because France had let a Jew like Dreyfus rise up so high in the military officer corps, which really would not have been or was much less common in the United States, for instance, or in England. I should just do a shout out to Derek Penslar's excellent book on Jews in the military.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you use that book well, and you quote that book well. And what Derek shows so well is just that it was becoming something more and more as an option for Jews. It was a nice option if you had the connections, if you had the interest, if you had the skills.
And they were there were some cases of anti-Semitism that, or instances of anti-Semitism that Dreyfus experienced coming up, but relatively few. I talk about one key one in the book where in officer training school, he was given by one teacher who was known to be anti-Semitic, he was given the top mark for knowledge and a 0 for character. And the guy admitted, I just don't like Jews. And Dreyfus, and he did the same thing to the one other Jewish student. And Dreyfus filed a formal complaint, which I thought was a really interesting thing. It showed that just his faith that the army would do the right thing. And it's a faith he essentially never lost. And it was a faith that he had reason to have that faith because, in fact, in general, the French army and French society was pretty open to Jews at that time.
And I think this faith that Dreyfus had in the system, whether it's the military or broader, I think this is something typically of French Jews, which the affair itself didn't diminish. If anything, the outcome of it enhanced it and reaffirmed it. I think that when we can turn out a little bit more specifically about the anti-Semitism, I think one of the things that's very instructive about your book and about the story of Dreyfus in general is, a lot of people who know some things are tempted by that lachrymose view of Jewish history, where persecution and adversity is the norm, is basically equilibrium, and Jews are going to suffer. And if you only know the first part of the Dreyfus story, if you only know the part about until the crowd yells death to the Jews, and you have a limited understanding, or that a variation on that. The other thing people know is Herzl watched the Dreyfus Affair and became a Zionist, which of course is not as simple as that. But it's this notion of anti-Semitism being something endemic and something always there. So let me ask the question this way. Clearly, France was teeming with that. There was this simmering anti-Semitism there, even before Dreyfus. But how mainstream would you say it was in the 1890s as opposed to something marginal? Where would you sit it if we call mainstream one pole and marginal on the other? Where would you situate it?
Well, if you ask that about the 1870s, I would say it was pretty marginal. But something began to change in the 1880s. And one of the catalysts for it was the publication of this book in 1886 called La France Juive, Jewish France, by this kind of unsuccessful unsuccessful journalist named Drummond. And that book became an enormous bestseller. And so it's hard to know, like, did he tap into something that was latently there? Probably, I think. But once he tapped into it, it opened a floodgate. So the late 1880s and 1890s, anti-Semitism became very mainstream. There's a guy named Marc Angenot who's a very interesting scholar who set out, I think he had a lot of research assistants, but he set out to read everything that was written in the year 1889. So he just, like, every newspaper, every novel, every book, and he was so overwhelmed by the amount of anti-Semitism that he had a whole spin-off of that book about, like, what people, so his main book was called What People Said in 1889, and then he had a kind of spin-off saying what people said about Jews in 1889, because it was so dominant and omnipresent. So I would say by the 1890s, anti-Semitism had become mainstream, especially in certain corners, not everywhere, but certainly among those people who felt left behind by the French Revolution, by economic modernity. So, aristocrats or even some workers, and the Socialist Party themselves became mostly anti-Semitic. And that would only change as a result of the affair, when half of the socialists, give or take, rejected anti-Semitism and came out in favor of Dreyfus.
So let me follow up with a 21st century perspective on what you just said, because right now we're dealing with a very new medium called social media, and in the 1880s, the genre of La France Juive, book publishing, was beginning to go through the roof, but also daily newspapers were beginning.
And he had a daily newspaper, a daily anti-Semitic newspaper, and he wasn't the only one. There were, like, competing daily anti-Semitic newspapers, and they were obsessed with, all they did was denounce Jews, and they were especially obsessed with the role of Jews in the military. And that's one of the things that was one of the immediate causes, I would say, of the suspicion that fell on Dreyfus.
Yeah, and his newspaper, La Libre Parole, the other technological advantage it has, this is when they could start easily printing images. Mm-hmm. And if you Google La Libre Parole, they were just putting those anti-Semitic images front and center. So even people who didn't want to read could just look at the pictures.
Horrifying things. Yeah. I include some of them in the book. they had like one series. This wasn't part of La Franche-Rive, but it was kind of similar in inspiration, called the Museum of Horrors, which was pictures of famous Jews as grotesque animals. So yeah. But like the cover of the Libre Parole would often have like a, stereotypical Jew with like grasping claws with money, stuffed in his pockets, and he would be clutching the world. It was like that kind of thing. Yeah.
And then explain how, because right before the Dreyfus Affair was the Panama crisis.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain how that fits into the story? And if you want to use the word Madoff, you can go ahead and do that as well.
Right. So, interestingly, there were a few scandals that happened, financial and political scandals that happened in France, that got blamed on the Jews, or associated with Jews. And one of them was the Panama Canal scandal, where the builders of the canal were running out of money, and they bribed French politicians to help them. And this all came out. And there were several Jews, kind of, important, influential Jews, including this guy named Reinach, and he committed suicide as a result of this. He actually, I won't go too into the weeds with this, but his nephew then, and they were a very wealthy, powerful family. His nephew was also a French politician, and he became one of the first and most ardent supporters of Dreyfus. So that was going on. There was also the crash of the Union General Bank, which was blamed on the Rothschilds, even though they really didn't have anything to do with it. And so that was also, and that ruined a lot of small French investors. And yeah.
So let's shift from the early parts, the trial, and to the latter part, when it really begins to grow. So one of the questions in the chat is, how did Emile Zola get involved in this? First explain what Emile Zola was in the 1890s in France.
Right.
This wasn't anybody, and how did he get involved in this?
Right. So yeah, good question. So he was one of the most popular novelists at the time, and he was a kind of scandalous novelist who was known for writing novels. He had a series of novels called the Rougon-Macquart series. There are 20 novels, highly recommend most of them, that were an attempt to write about every aspect of French life. So like one of them takes place at the food market, one takes place in a mine, one takes place at the stock exchange, and the characters are all members of the same family, loosely. So these were very popular, very, as I said, scandalous novels, because they often were very risque. One novel, which I'm teaching in a few weeks, is called Nana, and it's about a courtesan who crushes all these men who become in love with her, and she destroys them. So Zola was very much had a big platform. He was kind of an anti-Semite before the Dreyfus Affair. So I mentioned that he had a novel called Money, which was about the stock exchange from 1892, where he trades in a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes in that novel. I've written about that novel, and it's really problematic. But he was a loyal Republican, so meaning he believed in the idea of a republic. I don't mean it in our American sense. So he believed in democracy. He believed in the republic, and he felt like anti-Semitism. He saw how anti-Semitism was being used as a tool by the far right to destroy the republic. That it was a tool that would kind of inflame workers and inflame the common man and get them to turn against the Republic. So he understood what was at stake in the Dreyfus Affair, and really believed that the Republic had to stand up for truth and for justice, or it didn't mean anything. And so he took this courageous stand. Dreyfus's family and a few of the core Dreyfusard supporters had a sense. He had written a few articles denouncing anti-Semitism by that point, by 1897, 98. And at that point, they went to him and they said, "Can you help us? Can you do anything?" And he did. He wrote this bombshell article that I mentioned, J'accuse, where he basically blew the lid off the case. He exposed everything that, all the ways that the army was trying to cover up the real crime and blame everything on Dreyfus, knowing, and this was part of his gambit, he knew that he would be forcing the army officers to sue him for libel. And what he wanted to do there, because Dreyfus, we remember, had been found guilty in court-martials, in military court. So a libel case would be held in civil court. And he believed then that the army would not be able to cover up its lack of evidence, basically, against Dreyfus. And that did happen, although he was found guilty of libel and had to flee to England. And then he eventually came back and died in 1902, shortly after the conclusion of the affair. And some people speculate that he was murdered. So he died of asphyxiation. And some people suspect that his chimney was stopped up by a bitter anti-Dreyfusard.
Of course, a nice conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
But incidentally, there's that great 1937 film about Emile Zola, where the actor Paul Muni plays Emile Zola.
Great movie, yeah.
In the climax of the film, they have Zola's speech in court, where he's basically not even really mentioning very much that Dreyfus is a Jew. It's a travesty against France and the Republic and rights and all of those things. So he's really at the core of the Dreyfusard movement. How big did the movement get?
So, yeah, I mean, people say that it divided France. It's hard to know the exact numbers, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that, families were divided. There certainly were more prominent intellectuals, and that term intellectual in its modern usage to mean somebody who takes a stand in a political in the political arena, someone who's like an artist or a writer who does that. There were more of them were Dreyfusard, but there were some prominent anti-Dreyfusard intellectuals too. Like the Impressionist painters, for example, were split. So, and this is hard for me to accept because I love Degas and Cézanne, but they were on the wrong side. They were anti-Dreyfusard, whereas Manet and Monet, and of course Pissarro, who was Jewish, were pro-Dreyfus. So France split after Zola published J'accuse. It was so inflammatory that there were anti-Semitic riots throughout France, and something like 69 French cities had, and many of them with no Jews, had anti-Semitic riots. And the worst happened in colonial Algeria, where people were actually killed, and where Drummond, the anti-Semite, the author of La France Juive, was elected as a deputy from Algiers.
It's so interesting. So here's another question from the chat. This just in terms of this dissemination of anti-Semitic ideas, have you found anything about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were published in the 1880s? They were moving west, but yeah. I've never really heard them being part of this story. But I don't know.
I'm not an expert on that, although I mean it's come up, but that it doesn't really come up during the affair so much. But it's really typical of the conspiratorial anti-Semitism. So the protocols, it purports to be a meeting of wealthy Jews who were plotting world domination, basically. And it turns out it was forged. It's an obvious forgery, and it's copied from a French text originally. So there is a French connection there, but it was mainly in the Russian Empire that it kind of took off. But it's exactly the kind of conspiratorial thinking about Jews, this idea that Jews control the world, Jews are pulling the levers of power, they're out for no good, that we see behind all the anti-Semitic propaganda during the affair.
I love how you mentioned later in the book, after this was over and Dreyfus was brought back, and he's retried, and he has to leave the military, but he can rejoin civilian life, and he has this exchange with Theodor Herzl. He writes that article about Zionism, and I think I've seen it. I had to read it in school. But could you say a little bit about how Dreyfus felt, or to the extent after all this was over, how his Franco-Jewish identity was affected by it? What did he think about Zionism? What did he see about the future of Jews in France for himself, for those around him?
Yeah, so that was something I was very interested to find out in the book, because as I said, he wrote very little about Jews explicitly. So his letters to his wife, which they knew were being opened and read by everybody and probably knew they would be published, almost never mentioned Jews or anything Jewish. So it was this very private thing for him. And after the war, his wife, Lucy, takes a big role in Jewish charities, as do his children. So especially Pierre. So they're like leading figures in local Jewish charities. For instance, helping to resettle refugees from Germany and from Central Europe in the 1920s and 30s. So his wife and kids are into it. He stays pretty much out of that, though. But there is that really fascinating article where he weighs in on Zionism, and he, like a lot of Jews of his class, so well-to-do integrated Jews, again, I'm not saying assimilated, but integrated French Jews, thought Zionism was okay for, and maybe necessary for, Eastern European Jews who were suffering, who were not citizens, and I think he understood it as a possible solution for that. But he never thought that French Jews would need that, would need Zionism. I think he thought that Jews in the West, and not just France, but probably in the United States too, were at home. And, so maybe it would be okay for poor Jews in the West and for the suffering Jewish masses in Eastern Europe. But for French Jews, it wasn't necessary. That said, the Zionist newspaper tries to say, see, this proves he's on our side. That he actually is a Zionist at heart. I wouldn't go that far, but.
And it's so interesting because that mentality will later be called, I think by historians, it's going to be called third person Zionism. Let's create a Jewish state for them, for that Jew over there who needs it, but not for me. And what's also I found very interesting, and as I was reading it and I'm remembering that essay, is Theodor Herzl in the last interview he gave before he died. And I think in many ways Herzl and Dreyfus are similar figures. They had different experiences, but they were both had a sense of Jewishness. They both encountered certain forms of anti-Semitism. But in his last interview before he died with the Hungarian Jewish liberal weekly Egyenlőség, Herzl was asked in 1903, "Do you think Hungarian Jews should become Zionist?" And he said no. But eventually you will have to, but not today. Wow. So I think in many ways they were very similar figures who
Yeah.
had seen anti-Semitism but still had faith in the West and the rule of law
Yeah.
and the possibilities that Jews could still be included. I mean, I think obviously it's more striking that Herzl would say something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But even I think he had a sense that what he was doing was for the downtrodden and for the Ostjuden, but not for the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, Herzl would claim later that he had the inspiration for Zionism watching the degradation of Dreyfus in the courtyard of the École Militaire, where Dreyfus, there was a ceremony of 10,000 people chanting death to Dreyfus, death to Judas, and they ripped off his epaulets and broke his sword. And Herzl, of course, was covering that for a German newspaper, and he would later claim that historians have called into question that chronology. Like, he actually had the thought for Zionism earlier, and in fact, in his coverage at the time, he, like most people, assumed that Dreyfus must be guilty. So it was only later it made a good story. I think that it was
a good story.
It was a good story, and he later said, if this could even happen in France, then Jews aren't actually safe anywhere, and we need a Jewish state. So,
and I think the more telling one, or the early Zionist who was more directly impacted, I think, was Nordau. Because Nordau's path to Zionism was writing about the decadence of Western civilization, the French need for regeneration, and he saw Zionism as a sort of Jewish version of that. I think he situated the whole Dreyfus thing in a certain amount of decline. I don't think Herzl quite got that, at least not yet at that point.
Yeah, no, totally. And Nordau's speeches at like the first and second Zionist Congress are like explicitly make a connection with the Dreyfus Affair. And he was also really intent on blaming assimilated, to that problematic term, French Jews for not doing enough to help Dreyfus. That was one of his kind of hobby horses. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you mentioned assimilated. The fact that you don't just dangle the term mindlessly, and you really explore what it means to be a Jew in late 19th century France who is living with one foot comfortably in mainstream society and one foot with a sense of Jewishness, with really no contradiction between the two. I'm glad you brought that out, because I think that sometimes gets lost.
Yeah, I prefer the term I say in the book, integrated. They were integrated French Jews. But, to me, at least, I mean, it depends how you define assimilation. But to me, assimilation connotes rejecting Jewishness in order to become French. Whereas, like, for them, it was,
right. I mean that.
Yeah.
The way the term is often used is it's conflating assimilation with total assimilation.
Right.
Assimilation is a process. There's another interesting question here, shifting gears a little bit. Question asks that when you teach about Dreyfus to your students today, what's their reception? How do they receive the story? What's their reaction to the story?
Yeah, I teach about the Dreyfus Affair in a course that I haven't done for a couple of years, actually, but on Jews and French culture. And so it's a unit in that class that goes, I put it in the kind of larger history of that we've been talking about, from the French Revolution to the present. And, I think that it would be interesting to teach that course again now, with everything that's going on in the world, because I think there's always been a tendency to see the Dreyfus Affair as a triumph for democracy, for that open pluralist idea that held that Jews could become part of France. That side won during the Dreyfus Affair, and I would say until a few years ago, people there were cases of anti-Semitism certainly in France, but they were pretty isolated. But beginning around 2000, anti-Semitism has escalated in France, and now is escalating in other places too, as we know, including the United States. So I think that kind of triumphalist narrative that sees the Dreyfus Affair as kind of the end, oh, we won. I think now it's harder to see it like that. It now maybe represents, one swing of the pendulum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think also that with it was a victory. We don't want to belie that, but that you can't just have one victory and it lasts forever. Mm-hmm. But it is a situation where this is a clearly anti-Semitic moment, but the forces, larger social forces and political forces, rose and defeated it. The possibility of anti-Semitism being defeated is not something that inevitably is going to lead to Hitler or Vichy or whatever. Right. I think that's one of the telling parts of the story. And so let me use that as a preface to ask this question. The moment we're in right now. I mean, people, especially I would say let's focus specifically for Americans, for American Jews. With this recent surge of anti-Semitism, there are a lot of Jews who are trying to make the comparison. What is this like? And do you think right now in 21st century America, we're living in some kind, could Dreyfus and the Dreyfus moment and that situation, do you think it's in ways it's comparable to the situation American Jews are in right now? Standing on one foot, can you answer that very, very large question?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I tend to resist when people ask about, like, are we in the midst of Vichy or in the midst of the Holocaust? That I definitely don't think we are, because in those moments, the state turned against the Jews, whereas that's certainly not happening, at least yet or right now. But the Dreyfus Affair, where someone is where people kind of misunderstand and blame Jews for something they didn't do, I can see some parallels. I don't know how specific we want to get, but I don't know. I don't think it would play out in the same way, but I think there's, I think on certain college campuses now, there's a kind of tendency to jump to conclusions, to see, So I think,
I think that the telling numbers that there are so many attacks against Jews of various kinds, way disproportional to the numbers of Jews in the country.
Yeah,
Jews still represent something to people, and I think that cuts both ways. In the same way that for the Dreyfusards, Jews represent the inclusion of Jews, and anti-Semitism represents something. So
it's a good way to put it. I think still, as I said in that other book, in The Right to Difference, that somehow these debates over what is democracy and who belongs in it and who has rights to it, they always wind up coming back to Jews. Even if now in France, arguably, those debates more obviously happen around Muslims, I think, in France. So, they're more the kind of excluded group, I would say, in France especially. So.
Yeah, there's so much to it, and I returned to that whole issue of media, and it's not just, it's how people's perceptions are shaped, especially by a new form of media. And I think that's why Drumont, like you said, he was a nobody. He was such a failure. This whole thing just saved him. But isn't it also true, and correct me if I'm wrong, that after it was over, his career began to turn down. La Libre Parole had to shut down because they had no subscribers by World War I.
Yeah. And so it definitely declines. And but the kind of baton is passed to L'Action Française, which is this other journal in the 20th century that becomes, under the leadership of this guy, Charles Maurras, and that becomes the kind of new version of that. And that lasts, into World War II.
Let me ask you a larger question. Sort of a, moving forward, and I think this pertains to Leon Blum because he's the one who connects Dreyfus at the turn of the 20th century to the 1930s in Vichy. And,
Yeah.
there's two ways historians, there are some, I don't know much historians, but there are people who will draw sort of a line, an unbroken line from Dreyfus and other instances of late 19th century anti-Semitism in France and elsewhere, almost a straight line to Nazism and fascism in the 30s, in the late 20s, 30s. But others will say that, I think, for example, there was this book by, I want to say, Bruce Pauly, who said most anti-Semitism in Europe, Western Europe, was in decline before World War I, and then the trauma of World War I resuscitated and restarted it. So when you think about Dreyfus and the legacy of Dreyfus, I mean, are you inclined to see that the anti-Dreyfusard mentality was just there, steadily, uninterrupted, and then led right to the support for Vichy? Or could you see World War I as kind of this seminal moment for France, like other countries, which just upset everything and was something, set something in motion that was new, or at least
right? Yeah, it's a good and hard question. I mean, of course, World War I was different in France than in Germany because France won, so it didn't have like this, crippling. I mean, it suffered horribly and millions of, people were killed. So it was still a trauma, but it was seen as a triumph, and you didn't have to kind of look for who to blame it on in the same way as in France. But, that guy, it's Charles Maurice, who I just referred to. He's the one who, at his trial after World War II for collaboration, said this, is, the revenge of Dreyfus. He made the case. And, I see it more as a pendulum. I don't think that those forces of reaction and anti-Semitism ever totally went away, but they were on the run. So, the Dreyfusards who triumph, around 1900 in the Dreyfus Affair, then they kind of press their winnings, and in 1905 achieve the separation of church and state in France, which is a huge triumph for the Dreyfusard coalition. But that infuriates the right, the Catholic right. So again, those people are there. They're either, kind of one gets the upper hand than the other one. That tends to be how I see it.
I agree. I mean, that's a reasonable way to see it. I think, let me ask, we have one more question. Let's make this the last question from the chat. And I think it's a very good one. So in terms of lessons learned from the Dreyfus Affair, what do you think, for this is a people today question, for people today who are combating anti-Semitism or racism or discrimination, what's the takeaway from the success of the Dreyfusards that you think people today might be able to use as a template, as a blueprint, as an archetype to combat similar problems today?
Yeah. One thing is, and I think this is the main lesson from Dreyfus, is not to give up. And that, I think, if you're reading his biography, that's the sense that I tried to give when he had, I mean, you have to put yourself in his shoes. He had no idea why he was being accused of this horrible crime. They didn't even show him the evidence. He was cut off from his family, sent to this horrible island where he was chained to his bed, watched day and night, allowed no communication with anyone for 5 years. And yet he kept, I mean, it's hard to imagine like greater suffering. And yet he never wavered in his belief that truth and justice would win out. And it was because he never wavered that they did win out. Because if he had given up, then we never would have, they would have won, So the truth eventually came to light because he didn't give up. And so that to me, I think, is, one major takeaway. The other one that I thought a little bit about as I was writing it is, what it means to have a country so divided. And that certainly was the case then, where France was practically in a civil war. And that really resonated for me now. Like, how does the country get out of that? And, I have various thoughts, but it took some courageous leaders from various political sides, but who came together because they believed in the republic. They believed in democracy. And they understood the threat that anti-Semitism represented. They were willing to put aside other salient political differences to come together in this kind of unity cabinet. So, I would like to see that happening here. It hasn't so much yet, but we can.
But isn't it interesting that, really the ultimate victory for the Dreyfus House was it, and apropos for believers in a republic, their ultimate victory was in a national election. It was they motivated the voters who voted to preserve everything they believed, and so what Dreyfus was feeling isolated on Devil's Island, unbeknownst to him, his supporters in France were essentially fighting a similar kind of, or defending the same values, or trying to help them survive. So this really is the last question, and it's almost, because of the times, and since we're both academics, the question is, can you discuss what it's like, a word or two about your experience as a Jewish professor on campus today?
Yeah, this has been challenging, I have to say. The last few months, and I run this program to study anti-Semitism at Yale, and so I've been trying to organize events that maybe try to add a little nuance to student. It's been very disheartening, I would say, would be my initial answer, to see students and faculty members so willing to just, take one side or the other, rather than seeing nuance and seeing historical complexity. And that's been really, you start to think, are we not doing our job? And so, I've been trying to organize, various events that could, kind of add to that complexity. But, at the same time, I think people outside the university maybe imagine it's actually worse than it is. I don't think that it's, I don't think, it's unsafe in this sense. I'd like to see, more instances where the two sides in the conflict could actually talk together and have, kind of actual debates, rather than just, rallies and then feeling too terrified to say anything, which I think is the case. But it's been challenging.
Isn't that our Dreyfus-esque challenge right now? Not even so much advocating for one side or the other, but to restore civil discourse, constructive debate, nuance, complexity. That's what's really been under attack. And and I think, like Drummond, I think we're facing the power of a dissemination of information, which is working against us. We haven't figured out yet. At least on my campus, probably the same thing. We haven't figured out how to harness the power of social media yet. When we do, this will look different, but we have not. It's new, and we have not done it yet. Well, I want to thank you for a great conversation. I think the book is so good. I urge everyone out there to read it. And when you finish this book, read some of the other books in the Jewish Lives series. In fact, after you read this book, you should read Deborah Lipstadt's Jewish Lives biography of Golda Meir.
Yeah,
it goes on. Then read the one about Mel Brooks, Irving Berlin. The range of topics.
The one on Herzl is great, by Derek Penzler.
Yes.
Also, I think it's a really good one.
Well, they keep finding the right person to write the biography.
There's so many good ones, and you get a discount if you do code word Dreyfus. That's the discount code. You get a discount on my book on the Jewish Lives website, I think. Right.
Great. And on that note, thank you, Maurice, for talking to us, and everybody.
Thank you, Howard. That was a great conversation. I could not have asked for a better interlocutor, and I learned a lot from your own work on the Dreyfus Affair. So I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It was a great conversation.
Thank you both very much, Maurice and Howard, for that remarkable conversation. I invite everyone watching to please join us at the J again soon, and good night, everyone.